Hello, welcome to the shed. In today's video we're going to be making a very basic butt jointed and nailed box. Hope you enjoy. So this video is an accumulation of everything that we've done up to this point within the beginner series. Things like preparing your square, learning how to use your knife properly. In this case, probably not using a marking gauge, but marking gauges, how to cross-cut boards correctly. We're going to be doing that a lot today because we're making a box out of a straight piece of pine, which is this one here that I prepared in last week's video. So if you haven't seen any of those videos, I'll leave the links down below to the most relevant ones. And if not, you can find that in the playlist that this video is going to be part of. So to start up here today, I'm going to be using this piece of pine here, which is 12mm thick and 140mm wide. I'm going to be making this box so it's going to house the basic or the new Stanley Bailey hand plane, which means it's going to suit a lot of number 4 hand planes, and it's easily scalable to any size to allow for any size hand plane or for anything else you'd wish to put in a box. So what are our measurements for this? I'm going to make the sides of this box 280mm long, and because we're going to utilize the entire 140mm of this board here, obviously if we have sides and we want this to be the base that goes under the whole thing, we're going to have to subtract the two sides off the width of that board, and if they're both 12mm, that's 24mm off 140, which is going to get us 116mm. So we'll tackle that, and I'll show you how I go get that measurement after we've got the sides measured off. So let's jump in down here. We'll measure some of them off. I'll show you an extra technique that I haven't shown you before as to how to get a neat edge on both sides when you're actually cross-cutting the board, and so you can continue working along. It will involve using the process where how to cross-cut properly, and will involve the shooting board and the shooting plane. So if you're following along in this video, you might want to get your square, your marking knife, and your shooting board and plane out for your shooting board ready to go. You're also going to need something to measure, obviously, the width of the board, whether that's a ruler or a tape measure like I've got here. So let's get started, and we'll start measuring out our 280mm in 2 lengths, and then cut it and get ready to measure out the sides. So obviously we want to do our measurements like this. So we're going to measure out to 280, and then I like to bring my marking knife over the top of my marking like this, and then just push down so we get that marking right where we want it. We already found out what our reference face and edge was, which is this edge here, and this was our reference face. So we're going to bring the ruler in, we're going to rock a double bevel knife off to the side, push our square up against it, do a mark, and we're going to wrap that around just like so. Noting that when we did this in the other video that I am referencing off my reference face here when we come around the side, and then when we do the back, we want to reference off that reference edge once again. And so now we've got that marked. It has torn the fibers a little bit, which is a little bit unfortunate, but some of these soft pines like this, no matter how sharp your knife is, and this is very sharp, they still crush the fibers a little bit, and that's unavoidable sometimes. So now what I want to do is, because we're going to use this side and it's no longer really a waste side, we can come up against that mark. Now we want to tap across a little bit, and I saw Paul Sellers do this, and I've followed on from what he did with this, and I like to use this process. So you come across a few millimeters and then make another line here, and you wrap that line around once again. You can see here we have 2 lines right next to each other, and you've given yourself an area where you're going to saw in between these 2 lines. And if you saw my video where I showed you how you do cross cut for accuracy every time, I said that you saw off the line. Now if you're just doing one cut, that doesn't really matter so much, But it makes more sense when you're doing multiple cuts on a board like we are here, that you just saw in that gap and then you clean up both sides with your shooting board and your shooting plane, and then you've got a nice start to start again for your next measurement. You can go ahead and do multiple measurements all at once like this, but for the sake of this, I'm just going to show you the process once. It's not really speeding the process up in this case, however, it's just showing you a little more step by step how to do it. But you can obviously bulk do the measurements now, and because you're sawing in there, you could do your measurement from that second line. However, if you're using a tape measure like I am here, which is a fairly accurate tape measure, you really want that square edge to measure off so you can get a decent measurement. But if you're using a ruler, you could just go ahead and mark them. However, personally, I prefer to do one and then mark it again. And if you want them to match, once you've taken that one side off, you can use that to get your second measurement to ensure that they're both the same if you've got a few discrepancies in there or if you've fallen off your line. So let's jump back down in here, we'll get the bench hook and we'll saw this first piece off and then get the shooting board to work. So just like in the video where I did the cross cutting, we're going to use the gent saw again today because they're cheap, inexpensive, and everyone can get a hold of one quite easily. And a bench hook. Now, if you haven't got a bench hook, I don't know how to build a bench hook. It's very basic. It's literally just 2 stops on a piece of scrap, essentially. But I'll leave the link to the video down below if you'd like to make your own and would like a little bit of guidance on that. When you're chopping a wide board like this, sometimes you'll have some issues with the back end of your board down this end dropping. So if you've got some material that's about the same thickness as the base of your bench hook, you can just put that under there. In this case, my Vintage Squares stock is actually the correct thickness, so I'm just going to slide that in under the back there just to keep it level. And that allows you to get a more accurate cut, which was something I didn't mention in the last video. Doing this when you've got a longer board, it allows you to get a more accurate cut because your board's not tilting. So you might be looking at your lines and the saw's going a little bit off just because the board's tilted. So that's something to look out for. Just like before, we're coming in here. Now, in this case, we're aiming right for the center of those 2 lines, and we'll just start nibbling in the center. So we're going to nibble all the way across like so. So you can see I'm just keeping my finger here, and that's just as a little physical reference just to help keep me where I want to be, just so I don't stray too much. The shorter blade on this particular gent saw does make it a little difficult when you've got such a wide board like this, but once you've established that across, you can work with it. You see, I don't have a lot of movement in this because it's quite a short gent saw. You can get longer ones, and if you're doing wider material like this, a longer saw would be more beneficial for this. However, this is still going to work, so I'm just going to persevere with this and just show you that you can do it with quite a small, cheap saw. So we're going right across like we did last time, and now we're going to drop the heel down this end first. So I'm viewing just down here along the line in the back here, and now that I've come all the way down on that, we've now given ourselves an angle on the inside of this board, and we can just saw it away. So I'm keeping that angle that we had, lifting it slightly and just sawing through. Now, if we have a nice close look at this, I've got that line there on this one, and on this side, if you can see that, the line is intact, apart from that little bit of chipping on the pine, which is kind of inevitable with some of this soft wood sometimes. Even though it was scored, it did still chip out a little bit, which is unfortunate. However, we're still on that line. You want to remember which way you actually cut this off your board. So like I said in the previous video, when you're screwing these up, you need to know what your reference is. So in that case, matching here, it was this way around. So that's our reference edge and that's our reference face, because that was where our pencil line was and that's the way the board was attached. So if you're going to mark like that, you just want to make sure you know where your references are. Particularly that reference edge, that's the most important one to remember. That reference edge is here, so we can put the board this way into it. And we have our edge up against our fence right here. And you're just going to keep these shavings out of the way. There we have our piece. And just to show you that this is exactly what we wanted, we can see that that's straight on 280. Now we want to bring the other long piece in. Make sure you get it the correct way, and we want to square that back up to the line. Now we're going to go ahead and duplicate that once more to get the other side of our box. So now we need to look at how we're going to measure the ends of this particular box. So I'm going to bring you in here once more, and I'm just going to show you how I like to take a real world measurement to work that out. So in the case of this, the way I can do this is we come in and we take a measurement of 140 to start with. Marking it here. Then we come in with our boards and you line them up. So to do this, bring a square up in on your reference side, bring a square up onto that line, line your boards up against that, come in with your knife and make a little mark, which is just here. Now, to double check that mark that's been put here, we can then bring our ruler back in, and if we look at that, that is sitting on 116 millimeters. That measurement is a little bit over, which means these boards were slightly thinner than the 12 stated millimeters that they are. So we're kind of sitting between 116 and 117 millimeters right here. And so that is why I like to use something like this when we're doing, because you get a better measurement just instead of just going off what the board might say on the sticker here, which says 12 millimeters. So real world measurements is what I always like to do. It's going to remove discrepancies, and because you're working with hand tools, you have the ability to just manipulate things ever so slightly because you're not as rigid as using power tools. So we can do what we did once before, come in, mark the line all right the way around, and then we can go ahead and cut that off again. Now, if you don't want to put the double line on there with the shooting board, you don't have to. What you can do is just do your cut and then use the shooting board straight off that, and that'll still get the same effect as running the double lines. But the double cut lines just means you're going to tear out your good stock less because you've got a line there preventing that tear out. So I went ahead and cut just one of the sides off, just so I don't bore you with the repetitive action of just cross-cutting and then using a shooting plane. What I want to do here is, I've done one side. Now, to double check that we got our measurements right, yes, we used real world measurements, we knew what it was. However, I still like to check just to make sure that this side is correct, and before we go and waste more material on the other side, you want to just double check that we got it right. We want to line this board up like so on the edge. Want to place this one in here, and then we want to place the other board on the edge. Bring it all up. Now, if you have a nice close look at that, there's no overhang, it's smooth on both edges, which means we got this measurement correct. So because we got that measurement correct, we can now use this as a template to mark the second side. Speeding the process up, meaning that you don't have to go back to doing your real world measurements, because we have essentially a template for the other side. And we know that it worked, therefore we can just go ahead and do that. For you guys, I've gone ahead and we've got a second side already ready to go. We're now ready to assemble the main base of the box. Now, as I said, I like to use real world measurements, so before we do the base or the top of this, we're going to assemble the carcass. I'll go through the process that I use to hold these together, and we're going to glue and nail these. You could glue and screw them if you want, but because we're trying to keep this very basic in this instance, I'm just going to be gluing and nailing them. The nails are just going to give a little bit of extra strength to the boards for holding them together. We don't really need the nails. The glues would probably hold it. However, because the sides are going to be into the end grain, the nails are just going to give a little bit of extra holding power. We're not looking for a super strong box because this box will get more strength once the base is put onto it. So this main carcass holding part doesn't need to be as strong as you would think. So the glue I'm going to be using here is just Sally's Aqua here. It's just an external glue. I just use this for everything these days. I've used other ones. This is just what I currently have at the moment. Any of these sort of exterior sort of weatherproofy sort of glues actually work pretty well. Doesn't really matter with the brand. You could just use a basic glue, but I like this because if you get a little bit of moisture in your shop, it doesn't fail. So that's what I like. Uninsulated shop, so that's my solution. And I like this glue because it's a bit thicker and it just holds that a little bit easier. Now you might be wondering, how am I going to hold this together while I glue it and nail it? I'm going to use, as you've seen in previous videos where I've built things, I use these little picture frame clamps. They work well, so I'm just going to be using these little finishing nails. I mean, if you've got power tools and you want to use a finishing gun, go ahead, do that. But we're using hand tools here, Handtool Workshop. So I'm using these little finishing nails here, and you want them with the little button head on them so you can countersink them, so we can put a hand plane around the board to smooth it all out after it's complete to make sure there's no indiscrepancies. So for these, I do like to pre-drill quite often. Just a very, very fine pilot hole just means that they're not going to split your wood out, which is what you want because we're working with 12mm material here, so it's quite thin. So you just want to create a path of least resistance so your nails will go straight through. When we're talking about hammers, a little upholstery hammer like this is good because this thin edge here allows you to actually tap these nails to start them without smacking your fingers apart. So these work well, and because these are quite small nails, you don't need a lot of force to tap them on, especially with a pre-drilled hole there. So a little fine hammer like this will work. You can use large one, get away with whatever you've got, but if you do happen to have a little cheap one like this, go ahead, use that, it's going to work well. First of all, I like to put my reference faces out on these boards, and because if we look here, I've still got the markings and I transferred the markings to every piece. That one goes around that way, and so I'm just going to just show you basically how I like to align these like this. And so this is what we're going to end up with. It's always a good idea to do a quick little dry fit before you start gluing things together and ensure that it works the way you want, so you can come along with your board on top. Just double check that it's going to be the way you want, like this. And this is perfect for what we're doing for this project. So we can now go ahead and start the assembly. So I like to pick one corner, such as this, and we'll come in with our clamp like this, and you want to do this one up on the outside, which pulls that side in. So if you're looking just here, it's pulled this in from the edge. So now, before we do this one up, you want to get your clamp down. Now, obviously, if you're using on this, it's going to be about right. Now, this is just about getting your clamp ready prior to clamping, so you can put the glue on and then clamp it straight away. So bring that in, and you're looking to line this up with the edge just here, right? So you can actually go ahead and turn it upside down like this and just fiddle around with these until you get it where you want it. Now, while it's up the other way, and this is why I like to have two of these clamps, you come in like this and you can bring another clamp in on this side. It's a little bit of stuffing around, however, it's going to get you a good final product. Spending the extra time now doing this. So now you just want to, with the two clamps here, you want to loosen both of these and just ensure, so you can ensure that this clamp is lined up at this edge. Do it up, and then down this end you want to do the same, do it up, and you just want to make sure there's going to be no discrepancy. So you can see this is how it's going to come together. So now what I do in this case is I don't undo the whole thing. I'm just going to undo this and this just enough to slide our end board out, and now we can put our glue on this. You don't want a lot of glue on this. This is ingrained, so it will soak up a little bit of that glue. So you can just wait a moment and then just apply a touch more, like you can see we've done here. Because remember, we are nailing this, and then all we're doing is sliding that back in and doing this back up. And you want to make sure that it's pulled down tight this way before you do that clamp up. And if you think you need more clamping force going this way, you can just put another clamp in here to help support that if you really want to. In this case, I think that's holding it enough. And we're about to pre-drill this, so I like to lie it like this, so when you drill into it, the weight is coming down on the engine, actually further pushes this together the whole time. So in this case, I'm just looking for a tiny pilot hole. This is a 1.5mm drill bit, and we can clearly see here it is smaller than the nail, but just barely, and that's what we want. I'm going to be once again using the power drill here. You can go ahead and use freehand versions of this, but it's a little bit hard to hold some of these materials and use an egg beater drill, which I do at times, but in this case we're going to keep it simple, and most people have one of these drills, so it's going to make it that little bit quicker and easier to put it together. And these days I almost class the battery drill as a hand tool. It's very versatile, and I think it belongs in a hand tool woodworking shop. So along here we're going to put maybe 1, 2, 4 nails, I think. So we can come in and just decide 1 here, 2, 3, 4. So I'm coming in with 4 of them like this, and I'm just going to leave a little gap here so when we put the bottom on we can still nail up into here and not interfere. This one's going to be right up on the edge, or we could bring that in a little bit. You don't want it too close to the edge. So when you do this, you've just got to bear in mind that you've got to remember how thick that board is that you're drilling into. So you can see this row of holes here is about 3 to 4 millimeters in from the edge. This one's about 3, this one's 4. You want to try and keep them in a straight line. You can go ahead and drill, you can go ahead and like draw a line, but you don't really need to. But if you do think you need to, you can just put a 12mm line here, just so you know that you're going to get the holes where you want them. So you can go like this, and you can see that I'm hitting near my fingers. Even though I'm hitting them, I'm not injuring them with this. It started. Could see that I was riding off there a little bit. Sometimes this smaller head on the hammer is a little too small. So if that's the case, you can go to a full-size hammer, or I just have another small hammer like this. The head's a little wider, so it's easier to drive them in, and it's just got a little more heft behind it. So you can see that went in a lot easier just using this. Once we're done all of these, we'll come back, we'll countersink them so we can run a very fine set hand plane over it to tidy it up. Let me go ahead, we'll do the others, and I'll just give you a few shots here of you watching me assemble it exactly like this. So I'll be back with you in a few moments. So now that we've got that, we want to measure out the bottom of this. So we want to line it up on our board here. And then we can come in like this. And in this case, because I've lined it up flat on the other side, you can actually just run your knife along, and we've already got our knife line. Now that that's done, I'm gonna go ahead and cut this off again. Just like so. And we can just dial in the bottom of this box. And that's already perfect. So now we're going to go ahead and attach the bottom of this. Now, because I'm going to nail this, there's a little technique that I like to do is try and hold it where you want it, like this, without it moving. And now I'm going to punch a single nail in on this side here. And now we've got that, we can align off that nail, and to stop the rest of it moving, we can whack two in on this side. So what that's done is just helped to pull the whole thing together. You can wipe off this excess glue with a slightly damp rag. And now we can proceed to put the rest of the nails into this box. Because we can hold this primarily, I believe that, so 3 nails down each side and 1 on each end is more than enough. That's what I'm going to do. You got to watch out for is I just had this nail and it's just come out on the edge here where I don't want it, which is going to make it a little difficult to hand plane this side, so I'll probably have to just use a little bit of sandpaper or try and knock that nail back out. But it is already fully seated, so it's going to be difficult for me to get that one out, so that's just something you got to watch for. I did pre-drill to try and prevent that, but for some reason it still followed the grain and popped out on that side, so when you're making your own, be aware that that can happen. Before we go ahead and do the lid for this box, I'm going to get a punch and we're going to countersink these nails. Countersink nails, you want a very fine tipped punch such as this. That'll get the job done. So in countersinking these, I've only gone down from the surface maybe a millimetre, maybe not even quite that. So when I say a fine set hand plane, I do mean a fine set hand plane. What we can do now is actually go ahead and we'll hand plane this now before we finish off the lid. Now I'm going to set this hand plane as fine as I can get it. So I've retracted the blade, and as you can see, I'm not really taking any shaving. I'm taking very light feather shaving here. And we move it over here. Move it across. I happen to be going against the grain, so I'm going to turn it around this way. So I've actually hand planed as much as I can here now. The nails are back to the surface, so I don't want to damage my blade. So what I've got here is just a little bit of 240 grit sandpaper, and just going to work the surface like this by hand. You can use a block if you need to for this. And as you see here, that's one of the downfalls of using nails in a box like this, or screws, is that you can't work the timber as much as you would like with your hand plane. If you've got dovetails, you can keep going because you haven't got an issue of hitting metal and damaging your blade, which you don't want to do. So this is the workaround I come up with when I do a butt jointed box such as this. So if you have a little block, you can grab a block such as this. You just hold your paper on there. And that is one workaround that you can do if you're worried about damaging your blade, and you're still going to get a smooth surface. You want to come in from both sides so you don't blow out that end grain. On these sides here, and we're just sanding a slight chamfer into this end grain. I apologise for how this has come out with that nail there, because it does mean that I can't actually use my hand plane as I'd like to show you on this. However, things like this do happen, so you've got to work around it, and in this case I've just decided to leave it. That's smoothed off, and now the one last thing I want to do before we move on to the lid is we want to sand a chamfer in onto the bottom of this. It's going to be a very fine chamfer. Now you could definitely use your hand plane to do the chamfer on the bottom, but since I've done the chamfers on the side using the sandpaper, I thought we'd just continue with that. Now we want to move on and put our box back into the vise, and you want to hand plane the top of this so we can get it nice and flush for the lid to meet with it. So you want to come along these areas where it's high, hit them first, and then you move around the corner like that. It's still a little high just on this corner here. So you're kind of moving across and then moving it so you don't blow right out that side. You're kind of turning your blade around the corner to follow the grain. I just happened to nick the grain there, so to fix that, just putting a very light chamfer in here. My blade is catching on this soft pine a little bit. So my go-to solution when I'm catching on the soft grain like that is to just use a piece of sandpaper. So now what I'm going to do is move on and cut another piece similar to this, and we'll put a lid on. So then there's one other process that we need to do, and that is to stop the lid from sliding off the box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, get another piece of this board ready for the lid, and I'll get back to you and I'll show you how we attach the lid to hold it on the box. What we need to look at now is, obviously preparing this was the easy part. Now we've got to work out how we're going to hold the lid on this box. Now for this box, I'm going to make it very simple. I'm not going to put a handle on the top. The lid is going to come in here, so you can just grab it on either side or one-handed or on the edges and lift it, because it goes full length to the outside. You could put a handle in here, but there's no real need. What I'm going to do here is we're going to put two thin strips of material just on the inside of the lid here. Now the idea is it's going to be wide enough to stop it racking back and forwards this way, and obviously sitting there so it can't go this way. So we're going to have to line up these little bits, so we need to actually make our little bits of wood first. If you've got some little square beading or something like that, you could just use that. For this, I'm just going to cut a piece off the scrap from the first bit of wood that I was using. So I've got some material left here, so I'm going to make some little strips off this. So let's jump in and we'll just cut these little strips. The strips for this, they don't need to be very wide. They're probably just going to be glued in place. There's not going to be a lot of force on them, so I don't see there's any need to nail them. I'm thinking maybe some 12-15 mil strips, just a couple of them, one on each side, and we need to work out how wide they're going to be. And luckily for me, this piece of scrap I've got here almost fits inside here, so I'm going to whack it on the shooting board before I cut those strips off, and we'll get it to fit right inside the box here. So you can see that almost fits because it's almost the same width, so we want the same width as this side, and then we just want to take a little bit more off that so there's a little bit of movement in it so it's not too tight. Now that is squared up, we'll see that the fit here, so there's a tiny bit of movement there, so when the lid's on there it doesn't get jammed, and so if there's any wood movement it ain't going to jam it either. But we can see that this piece is probably 2 or 3 millimeters narrower than the gap. I'm going to use a marking gauge. I wasn't necessarily intending on doing that at first, but I've decided that I'm going to just take a couple of strips. Now we want them in the longitudinal direction. Since our edge pieces are about 12 mil, I think I'm going to make this a little bit wider. We'll make this one about 15 millimeters. A reference edge is this side. Now for these strips it doesn't really matter too much, so I'm actually going to mark one on one side and just one off the other side. I'm just going to put it on the shooting board here because I've got square flat edges, and now that's good to go. Turn around the other way, give that one hit. And we can see that this is a very quick and easy way to do something like this, especially with small parts. Because it's hard to hold small parts to just use a bench plane. But like this you can just tuck up on them and get them done. So now we've got these, we obviously have to work out exactly where on the edge we want them to sit here. Now we could just go 12 mil straight off the thickness of these edges and stick them in right there. The only thing with that is that it might make it a little bit too tight. So what I'm going to do is get it there and then back it back just very little, just like we had sideways, just so the lid doesn't want to get stuck on the box and we can't remove it. We just want a little bit of leeway to play with. So let's go ahead and we'll mark some little marks on here with the marking gauge, just so we know where to line it up. And we want to bring this down and have the bottom of it drop just here. And we lock it off. Now we've got that 12 millimeters set on here. Double check that here. And now, with this micro adjustment here on this one, I can undo the top one and just pull it back a touch, maybe half a turn towards me. And now I can see that this is set to 13 millimeters, which is what we want. So I'm going to come in, just going to make a little notch there, and on this side a little mark. Now we don't need to necessarily see those marks, we just need to use it as a little bit of an alignment so we know where we're sitting them. Likewise, we want to come in this way because it's going to be a very similar marking. So we have our lines like this, here, here and here. So we know when we bring this piece in that it's got to sit inside there, and we'll be able to line it up and glue it in place, just like that. So now we know exactly where those stops are going to go, and go ahead and glue them in place right now. Now it can be a little bit hard to keep them there, so in this case I'm just going to use a little bit of super glue just to hold these in place. It's going to be nice and quick and set fairly quickly, and I won't use activator because I want to be able to adjust it just a little bit to get it where it goes, but it's still going to set fairly quickly. I'm just going to use a medium super glue for this. Just this one here, 2P10, just happens to be what I had available here, so it doesn't really matter what super glue you're using, but a medium is going to be good because it's not going to run too much. So the process I'm going to work with here is just one straight line, that should be enough. And then we've got to come along, line it up with our stop lines that we put there. Now we can just push that down, apply a bit of pressure, and it'll set fairly quickly. Within probably a minute that'll be set. As you can see, that's already holding. Now we need to apply the other one. And now that one's set. Now we want to do a test fit with this, and if you've made any little mistakes with your lines and it's a little bit tighter than you'd like, you can come in with a nice sharp chisel and just pare a little bit off in any spot that it's giving you problems. So now, for the moment of truth, let's fit the lid. And you can see we have a little bit of movement that way, a little bit that way, which is exactly what we want. So it's not going to be a very tight fit, as you can see here, but it's not going to move enough to cause any problems at any end. So there you have it, folks. There's a fairly basic and simple box, one of the most simple that you're going to be able to make. And it's great as a first project, I believe, because it's so simple and easy, just using a few basic processes. One thing you do have to watch out for, which I had troubles with, how soft this pine was. And even though I had a sharp hand plane, which I sharpened prior to doing this video, I was struggling to hand plane some of this pine because of how soft it was, and it was just catching and denting. I've not experienced pine quite as soft as this before. However, you just deal with it, and moving to the sandpaper was the solution that I had in this situation. Obviously, I also had the problem of that nail punching through on the side just here, and that's just the nature of using nails, and that's why I prefer to use either screws or doing proper joinery using dovetails and grooves. That's the ideal way, and then you don't have to deal with things like a little nail punching through. Now it's up to you. There's a few things you could have done with that nail if it had punched through. You could have pulled it back out and just put some filler on the hole there and just drill a new pilot hole and put the nail in right next to it. Or in this case, since I was just making this box as a demo for you guys and as an example to store a hand plane in, I wasn't too worried about that. Now, obviously you can put finish on a box like this if you want to, and in an upcoming video I'm going to be talking about the different finishes that I like to use, and we'll show maybe the use of shellac or something. So we will put a finish on this box in an upcoming video when I show that, so do stay tuned for that. So if you liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing down below. It really does help the channel out more than you know. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider checking me out on Patreon, or giving a super thanks, which is below this video, if you got some value out of the video. That'd be very much appreciated. And if you'd like to see some more videos, such as this one right here, please check out the precision cross-cutting video, which goes perfectly with this video, and the beginner playlist that this video is part of. Bye for now.